The sun had barely climbed over the Wyoming hills when Elias Turner stepped out of his ranch house, coffee in hand, and looked over the frost-tipped pasture. The land was vast, quiet, and lonely, just like him. 2 years had passed since his wife's death, and though his ranch had survived droughts and dust storms, the hollowness inside the house never healed. His twin children, Grace and Samuel, had stopped laughing the day their mother was buried on the hill behind the orchard. Now, at 6 years old, they hardly spoke to anyone but each other. That morning, the ranch foreman told him a widow had come asking for work. "Name's Clara Dawson," the man said. "Lost her husband in a mining accident. Says she'll do any kind of labor, cleaning, mending, feeding stock." Elias sighed. "If she can handle a broom and don't mind the dust, I'll give her a chance." Clara arrived before noon, walking the long trail with nothing but a small carpetbag. Her dress was faded, her boots cracked, and her face, though lined with exhaustion, still carried a quiet strength. "I can clean barns," she said softly, "and I don't complain much." Elias nodded. "Barn's out back. Tools are in the shed. You'll get supper and a cot in the loft." She thanked him and went straight to work. By sunset, the smell of old hay had lifted from the barn, and even the horses seemed calmer. Elias watched from the fence as she hummed a low tune, a lullaby, he realized. His late wife used to hum the same melody when the twins were babies. The sound stirred something buried deep within him. The next morning, Elias found something unexpected. The twins were missing. Panicked, he searched the yard until he saw the barn door slightly open. Inside, in the soft straw, Clara sat with Grace and Samuel curled up against her sides, both fast asleep. She had read them a story, her voice a whisper under the creak of rafters, and they had drifted off in her arms. For the first time in months, peace filled the barn. Elias didn't speak. He simply watched, the widow's gentle hand stroking Grace's hair, Samuel's small fingers gripping her sleeve. When Clara noticed him, she startled. "I'm sorry, Mr. Turner. They came in while I was sweeping. They looked so tired I just let them rest a moment." Elias swallowed hard. "Don't apologize," he said. "They haven't slept through a night since their mama passed." From that day on, the ranch felt different. Clara worked quietly but with purpose, mending fences, baking biscuits for the twins, singing as she swept. The children followed her everywhere. When she laughed, they laughed. When she spoke, they listened. Elias watched her with a cautious respect. He had seen plenty of drifters pass through looking for work, but none had that quiet kindness that turned a place of sorrow into something warm again. One evening, a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the pines and lightning split the sky. Grace and Samuel ran crying into the kitchen, trembling from the thunder. Clara knelt, drawing them close. "It's only the sky talking," she whispered. "Your mama used to tell you that, didn't she?" The twins nodded. Elias froze where he stood. "How'd you know?" Clara smiled faintly. "I didn't. But mamas talk the same way everywhere." Days turned into weeks. The ranch prospered again, as if the land itself had been waiting for laughter. Still, Clara never spoke of herself. One night, Elias found her sitting on the porch, looking at the stars. "Do you ever miss your home?" he asked. She smiled sadly. "Home isn't a place, Mr. Turner. It's people. And the ones I loved are gone." He looked down. Maybe not all of them. Their eyes met, briefly, softly, and in that look, something unspoken began to grow. When spring came, the valley bloomed. Clara's hard work turned the barn into the heart of the ranch. The twins brought her wildflowers every morning. They began calling her Miss Clara, but sometimes, in their half-asleep voices, she heard Mama. Elias pretended not to notice, but every time he did, his chest ached with gratitude. One afternoon, he returned from town to find the barn unusually quiet. Inside, Clara sat with both children asleep again in her arms, sunlight pouring through the open door. The sight stopped him cold. For a long moment he said nothing. Then softly he murmured, "You've done more for this family than I ever could have asked." Clara smiled. "I didn't do anything special." "Yes," he said, his voice thick. "You reminded us how to live." That summer, the ranch hands whispered that the boss seemed lighter, even smiled sometimes. But gossip didn't bother Elias. Each evening, he found himself walking toward the barn, sometimes to fix a hinge, sometimes just to hear Clara humming with the twins. One night, as fireflies drifted over the fields, Grace asked, "Papa, is Miss Clara going to stay forever?" Elias hesitated. "Would you like her to?" Both children nodded eagerly. "She makes the house happy again." He looked out at the porch, where Clara sat sewing under the lamplight. In that moment, he made up his mind. The next morning, Elias hitched the wagon and drove to town. When he returned, he handed Clara a small box. Inside was a simple silver brooch, shaped like two joined hearts. "I saw this and thought of you," he said quietly. "Of what you've given my family." Clara's eyes glistened. "You didn't have to." "Maybe not," he replied, "but I wanted to." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the warm wind tugging at her hair. Then she whispered, "Thank you, Mr. Turner." He shook his head. "It's Elias." Weeks later, on a golden autumn evening, the twins prepared for the harvest fair. Clara baked pies, Elias hitched the horses, and laughter filled every corner of the house. At sunset, when the family rode down the lane together, a neighbor tipped his hat and said, "Turner, you look like a man who's found his peace." Elias smiled. "Maybe I finally have." At the fair, Clara danced once, with Grace and Samuel between them, and the look in her eyes told him what words never could. That night, after the fair, they returned home under a sky bright with stars. Clara tucked the twins into bed and stepped outside. Elias was waiting on the porch. "They're asleep?" he asked. She nodded. "Like angels." He hesitated, then took her hand, rough and calloused from work, yet softer than anything he'd known in years. "I hired you to clean my barn," he said, voice low. "But you cleaned more than that. You cleaned the dust off my heart." Clara laughed softly, tears shining in her eyes. "Elias Turner, you've got away with words you don't use often." "Maybe I just needed the right reason," he said. From that night on, the Turner Ranch was never lonely again. Clara stayed, not as a worker, but as part of the family. Grace and Samuel called her Mama without hesitation. The laughter that had once vanished now echoed across the meadows each morning. And when Elias stood with Clara by the barn door, watching the sunset paint the prairie gold, he knew that sometimes love didn't ride in like thunder or blaze like lightning. Sometimes it came quietly, in the arms of a widow, with 2 sleeping children, and a heart brave enough to start again.